Welcome everybody at Amarjit. We have our presentation this morning on Centering Equity and Collective Impact with Paul Schmitz, and we'll do some introductions very soon, but let's start with karakia. Tu taua mai I ranga, tu taua mai I raro, tu taua mai I waho, tu taua mai I roto. Kia to ai, te mauri tu, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, homie, huie, tai kie. Cool. My name's Amarjit Maxwell, and I am the CE at Collaborative Aotearoa, and I'm here with some colleagues, and as I say, we're focusing on centering equity within collective impact. But I'll just do my own introduction. Ko Tararoa te Monga, ko Waikanai te Awa, I tipu ake aho I Gateshead, England. Ko Wayne Maxwell takutane no Wairarapa ai, ko Flynn Roa, ko Tara aku Tamariki, ko Amarjit Maxwell aho, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Really excited about this session, and Paul Schmitz from the Collective Impact Forum has been working with us for some time now and supporting our journey on collective impact. And as many of you know, we are advocating very strongly for that collective impact approach to localities in terms of the health reforms. So centering equity is everything that we're all about. So I thought it was really timely for us to invite Paul to speak to our sector and really just share his learnings in recent times, and the history that he comes with is very rich. So Paul, can I ask you to introduce yourself? And I know that we've got a short time, so I'm going to be quiet, and yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Margie. I'm Paul Schmitz. I serve as Senior Advisor at the Collective Impact Forum, and have my own firm called Leading Inside Out. For 20 years, I led a national nonprofit organization in the United States called Public Allies, where I work to do basically grassroots leadership development in 25 cities across the country and help 7,000 diverse young adults begin careers in public service and social change. And having done that work at the grassroots for many years in communities, began in 2014 a journey of really working with efforts that are building coalitions in communities to solve problems. And so that's kind of the journey I've been on in this work. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is about 90 miles north of Chicago, in the middle of the country, in the kind of the upper middle. And and it's Thursday afternoon here, so you'll have to tell me if Friday's a better day. Thursday has been really crappy here weather-wise. Maybe y'all can tell me what Friday's like, as I feel like I'm peering into the future with all of you. And with that, I think the plan for today is I'm going to walk through and kind of frame the work, and I will provide you the deck of slides that I'm using today, so you'll be able to get that. I've shared that deck with Amarjit, and she'll be able to send it to everybody who's registered after the event. And so if you're trying to take notes, it's also being recorded. All of this is there. I'm going to start, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to present through, and then we're going to do a brief breakout to allow people to process a little bit, and I'll explain what we'll do with that, and then we'll come back and do questions and answers to kind of close out. Let me get this going. And so I want to start by just kind of framing again that the work that the framework that we're operating in and thinking about this work is within collective impact. And I always like to think of collective impact not as some complicated model. Really what it is, it's a description of the best practices effective coalitions have always used. And I think when I did my last presentation, I told a story about the civil rights movement in the United States, and I often tell stories about other points in history where we can look at it's the same thing, that effective coalitions that are trying to move population change or systems change have always had a clear common agenda, a set of results and strategies at the level of scale and complexity needed to move the needle they're trying to move. In order to get there, they've got to share measurement. They've got to have ways of like tracking their performance and measuring it and adapting as they go to make sure they're on the right track. To do that, they also have to align action. They have to get everybody kind of rowing in the same direction, or at least aligned in how they're rowing. We've got to get people in different organizations and groups moving together. And to keep that going, you have to have some type of continuous communication and engagement that keep people working together. And then someone's got to facilitate all of that. And so while a lot of people have looked at collective impact as it's like technical formula, really what it is, it's in my eyes, it's a collection of the best practices effective coalitions have always had. And to me, there's three lessons that have kind of driven the way I've thought about collective impact and what I've learned from working with hundreds of efforts. The first is that clear strategy guides clear commitment, that the clearer we are about the strategies we're moving and the measures we're trying to move, the easier it is to keep people committed and engaged. And so the simple example I give is that if we set a goal that in 5 years, every child will read at grade level by 3rd grade in our community, and we're not really tracking anything other than the overall level, and our goal is everyone, then everything everyone does counts. Anything anyone does to help someone read counts. But if instead we say, we're going to move 3rd grade reading scores from 60 to 80%, to do that means moving 400 more kids a year to our result. And we know that primarily those kids who are further behind are in 14 schools in this part of our community. Then we can target our actions at what would it take to move 400 kids more a year to this result, and how do we focus in those 14 schools that have the biggest disparity. And that level of clarity and precision in our strategy makes it so if I join that coalition, I realize my work is helping move those 400 kids. It's much clearer and it involves a change. So clear strategies make it easier for people to commit and stay together and measure their work together. The second is that the form follows function, that how we organize a collective impact should be in response to the strategy, not the other way around. And so often the people who design the strategy aren't necessarily the people who have to implement it. And the idea is that once we've decided what the work is, then we figure out who are the people we're going to need around the table to do that. And it often means bringing new people to the table, to changing kind of who's in what seats, but that the form of the collective needs to be different. And the form always looks different depending on it. We have in my city a collective impact focused on teen pregnancy that has 3 work groups and 2 part-time staff backboning it. We have a K-12 education, which has 9 full-time staff at the backbone and 7 work groups. Every collective impact looks different because it should be organized around what is it going to take to move this particular needle. And it might be as simple as 1 work group and a small steering committee and a part-time backbone, or it might be something very complex. It takes a lot of people and a lot of different work. But the idea is that if we've got a clear strategy, the strategy should drive how we organize the form of our collective. The third is, to me, often the most important, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast, that how we set up our collective impact, that at the end of the day, we can have a great strategy, but if we don't have trust, if we don't have inclusion, if we don't have a spirit of collaboration, if we're not holding each other and ourselves accountable, if we don't have those like cultural pieces, and we're not facilitating meetings that people want to go to and feel are productive and keep us energized, if we don't have a culture that makes it go, it's going to fall apart. And often what we find is in our work, kind of, I always joke that part of my job is doing collective impact repair. A lot of our repair work often is around because there's a lack of trust and there's a lack of inclusion and there's people not showing up and no one's held accountable. And so that culture piece becomes really important. One of the things that threads through all of this, as we came to the 10th anniversary of the collective impact original article that defined collective impact, that again didn't invent it, was describing something that had organically grown up in other communities, but reflected on what we learned and what we wanted to say about it. Probably the most important thing we've learned is the centrality to equity within collective impact. And it applies at all 3 of these levels, that to have a clear strategy, we've got to understand, are there inequities in our results, in our populations we serve? Are there disparities that we need to serve? Are we building a collective impact for our steering committee groups in ways that are inclusive and equitable in terms of who's at the tables and how power operates and kind of who's represented and reflected? Do we have a culture that supports kind of equity and how people work together and how meetings are run and who's listened to and who's engaged and how community participates? And so for us, as we thought about what does it mean to like do this work, our reflective piece that we all co-authored together was about centering equity and collective impact. And that's what I'm going to guide you through, is kind of the key lessons we learned about what it takes to do that well. First, we have to be clear about what do we mean by equity. And I always joke that there's all these images on the internet of equity, and there's like more blogs criticizing the images than there are images. And I'm kind of, but to me, the basic point of it is this, that historically, at least in my context, in public policy and philanthropy and social change work, there's been an equality mindset. An equality mindset says, if we can just get everyone better access to the same services or interventions, they will all achieve better outcomes. An equity mindset says people start in different places. So if we just give them all access to the same opportunity, service, intervention, that doesn't mean they're all going to get to the same outcome. That because people start in different places, we have to differentiate what we provide to people if we want to move them all to the same outcome that we aspire to for them. And so, simply put, that's that difference between equality and equity. Is, are we providing everyone the same thing, or are we recognizing that people are different in different places, often because of forces outside of their own control? And can we, in ways, differentiate what we do to bring them along and shift that? So when we thought about what are the things that we've learned about what makes it possible to center equity, there are 5 things that we came up with. And I'm going to walk through these one at a time and give an example of each. And again, you'll get all these slides at the end of the presentation. The first is grounding the work in data and context, and in targeting our solutions, and the importance of that in terms of understanding the work. And there, what we think of often is something that's called targeted universalism, or applying an equity lens to an issue. And in that case, we often start with the universal goal, like we'd like all of our children to graduate high school, or we'd like to see teen pregnancy driven down by 50%. We have some goal. Within that, we disaggregate data about our populations to understand where different groups are relative to the goal. And so we look for disparities, which may be by race, or by gender, or by geography, or by other forms of difference, but we try to understand where are there potential disparities within our populations. Then we understand, for those different populations experiencing disparities, what are the structures that support or impede them? And so we can look at the role in my community that history has played in segregating our communities and creating certain conditions. We can look at how other policies or issues affect populations, how racism itself might, if we're talking about racial equity. But then we start to understand, like, what are the differing ways that different populations are impacted by the issue? And then we target our strategies in ways that are different towards different subpopulations to move everyone to the goal. That we recognize that certain populations might need different types of interventions than others if we're going to get them all to our goal. So that's the idea of targeted universalism. And again, it's grounding the work in data, understanding the data on the population we serve in relationship to the goal, disaggregating it, understanding where there are disparities, understanding what are some of the forces in society that produce or have upheld those, and then trying to target solutions toward that. So that's the first piece, which is really grounding the work in that context and applying an equity lens on the outcomes. The second is to focus on systems change. And systems change is effectively changing the conditions that hold a problem in place. And there are really 6 types of system changes. There's the mental models and narratives that people hold. So if I believe that people are in poverty because they're lazy and don't want to work, then I build that mental model, and then that becomes a barrier to moving people forward. Another system that gets in the way is when relationships and connections are lacking. When you've got multiple organizations that serve the same family and they don't talk to each other, or the same neighborhood, or you've got systems that are disconnected from each other, and someone who's been incarcerated goes out on the streets, and like the organizations in the community that work with formerly incarcerated don't get information on who's getting out, and people have to find them themselves, and there's no connection to that. And you've got these systems that aren't connected to each other. Another system that holds problems in place is power dynamics. When the people making decisions about communities and things don't really understand the way things work within a community, and people who have that expertise don't have voice or power at the tables that are making decisions about their work and about their communities. And those power dynamics often halt things. Resource flows is another, and that's when the way that dollars flow to the issue might be holding the problem in place, that the way public and private resources flow. And so we might have a situation where there's restrictions on public grants that actually get in the way of distributing them. When we had the COVID crisis, there was a need to get some of the added federal dollars that were coming to our county to grassroots organizations, but their contracting process was way too complicated for smaller organizations, and it was restricting the resource flow to them. So we had to address the system of the contracting system and get that shifted so we could get resources flowing to groups that really needed it. Then you've got rules and practices that hold the problem in place. My favorite I learned recently, a few years ago, was that our state had a rule, for whatever reason, that if someone received a donated car seat for a baby, it had to be provided by a licensed car seat technician, which was something that someone had to go through training to get, and they only offered the training twice a year. A lot of the agencies that dealt with distributing donated goods had a higher turnover of staff, and they had a backlog of car seats that people needed because they couldn't get enough training. And so we had to shift the rule that was blocking people from getting that taken care of. And then finally, you've got public policies. You've got the legislated policies that often hold problems in place and get in the way. The challenge with systems change is that people often think of the top of the pyramid and don't think of the bottom. But actually, to move the things on the top, you often have to change the way people are connected to each other. You have to change power dynamics, and mostly you have to change mental models and beliefs about the issue. If people misunderstand the issue, it can lead to them not supporting it. And so if we think about systems change, we have to think about all of these things. But also when we think about racial equity, we have to recognize where equity sits within these, because often mental models and stereotypes are biased based on historic beliefs or experiences with disparate groups. There's often relationships and connections missing, and often those, especially between kind of dominant minority groups in a community, are disconnected. Often minority groups don't have power or are treated disparately within groups and lack that power. Often resource flows in our context here often go to white dominant organizations or larger organizations versus grassroots organizations, which are more likely led by people of color. We often have rules and practices that are shaped by tradition that in ways don't meet the need of communities now. And we have public policies that in many ways have discriminated against communities. And so if we're looking at how to create equitable change, we have to understand, where does equity sit within systems, or inequity sit within systems? And we have to have that analysis and make sure that's part of our strategy along with any other interventions. The third is about shifting power within a collaborative. And here we have to understand what power is. And it's really the ability or authority to influence others, to decide who will have access to resources, and define reality or exercise control over oneself or others. And we have to understand there's often two forms of power or authority. There's the formal, which comes from someone's position and the resources they control. And then there's informal authority, which often comes from someone's relationships or credibility with stakeholders. And someone can have both, but sometimes we only focus on formal authority and not informal, and we miss the roles that power play. But also importantly, if we're thinking about equity, we have to understand in this complicated diagram, it's actually quite simple. If we imagine our intended beneficiaries that we serve, the issues they're facing in the neighborhood they live in at the center of our table, if we look at the bottom right quadrant, the question is, how many people at the table making decisions currently live in the community with these people in their neighborhoods, or have family members who live there or have lived there in the past? How much does our table reflect our target population demographically, or represent other marginalized groups at our table who bring different perspectives? How many of us at the table have lived experience on the issue we're working on, or have family members who have lived experience? How many of us are in direct relationship and proximity to that population every day and really in deep relationship, or even manage people who are? And the challenge from a power dynamic is, if the group making decisions is all on the outside, do they really have the best information about the community, the people, and the issue to make great decisions? On the other side, I would argue, if people are all on the inside, they might be too close to gain perspective. And so that's why it's important to make sure our tables are equitable, that we bring different perspectives, but especially that we lean on perspectives that are closer to the people, the population, and the issue. The fourth is about listening to and acting with community. And here we like to just remind people of the notion of, or the practice of asset-based community development, and the age-old question of whether the glass is half empty or half full. And of course, the correct answer is yes. It's just like me and you and everyone we work with and serve. All of us are half full. We all have gifts and talents that make us great family members, friends, workers, leaders. And all of us also have emptiness, things we don't do well, mistakes we've made, regrets we hold. But community service is often about people who've been defined by their fullness, going into communities that have been labeled by their emptiness to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness, with the notion that our job is to fill them up with some of our fullness. And we think that at best is arrogant and at worst oppressive. And that leadership in this context is really about the ability to really see those assets, even when we're staring into the emptiness. That we know that in any given community, we can find all of these things. If I go to our most vulnerable communities here, I could find all of these things if I want to. And these things are often the things that get the most attention, the most media, and they're often the way these communities are viewed. But I also know if I look at any community that has all these things, I can find every single one of these things as well. And the question is, are my eyes open to both? And if I can see all of this, and I can recognize that there's tremendous assets and leadership and potential in this community to partner with, not to do things to, but to partner with, then I can think about, what's the way that we're going to shift power by engaging the community? And the simple chart is that if we start on the left side and we inform that we're making decisions about a community, and our job really then is informing the community and orienting them to change. If we're consulting, then before we make decisions, we listen to the community, and then we report back kind of what we heard and how it influenced us. If we involve the community, every step of our process, from defining the problem to coming up with options to considering options and making decisions, we've involved community every step of the way. Collaborate is to co-labor. It means really a true partnership where the people making decisions, at least half of those reflect or represent our intended beneficiary community. And it's really that we are sharing full power with the community. And finally, there's empowerment, which is that the community makes decisions and we support whatever they decide. We have no veto power. We do what they say. And the challenge is, people often use language on the right side of the spectrum while delivering engagement on the left side. And our goal is to move as far as we can to engagement that listens and acts. And that's why we say listen and act with community. It's not just that we use community as a sounding board, but we recognize that the woman who checks in on young mothers in the neighborhood is part of public health. And the man who watches kids on the playground to school is part of youth development. And it's recognizing that we partner with community, not just listen to them in the production of outcomes and social change. The fifth and final piece is about what does it mean to lead in an equitable way and be accountable for leading with equity. And my colleague Dominique Samari and I have put together a list of things that we thought about the leaders we thought who did this really well and what did they do. And the first thing we saw was leaders who really seek out authentic relationships to share and learn, that they were truly self-aware of their need to build those relationships, to be authentic and vulnerable with each other, and to really seek out actively relationships with people different than themselves. The second is that the leader makes visible commitments that articulate measurable goals and expectations and invites others to hold them accountable. They say, this is what equity is going to mean at my organization or my effort, and then they're willing to be held accountable for that definition. The third is that they look at their hiring, their promotion, their compensation, their policies and culture, and look for where could inequity or bias be hiding? Where might there be disparities? Not because they're intended, but what we want to know is where might it be happening even when we're not intending it? And how do we set measurable goals to reverse that with clear accountability? The fourth thing is we realize we've had disparities in our work, that we acknowledge and redress any harms that past practices have caused. The fifth is that we demand diversity at the tables we sit at, that we won't make or enable decisions without diverse perspectives and participation. That if we realize the table doesn't have enough, we say, listen, we're going to pause this process and come back to it when we get the right people around the table. The sixth is that we build and share power. We transmit our privilege rather than hold it. There are people who, by nature of their experience and their life and their work, have power and privilege, and that's not a problem unless they hoard it. And when they're looking for interns, they hire their friends' kids, or they're writing recommendations for their friends' kids, or they're doing things for others who are in their class or social group, rather than recognizing that if I do that work, I have if I'm trying to lead with equity, I've got to make sure I'm creating pathways for people different than myself, that I'm making sure I'm not just reinforcing privilege in who gets opportunities that I see, but I'm creating new pathways for people to opportunity. The seventh is to show up for leaders of color, for leaders who are different than you, for organizations led by them, and public issues impacting their communities, and not just ones that affect your organization's self-interest. But you're showing up because it's important to them, not because it's important to your self-interest, but because it's important to their interest. And that shows that you care. And finally is that you're visibly willing to take stands and even risk or sacrifice resources and relationships in order to stand up for racial equity and justice. I saw this with a community foundation that I work with, where the CEO heard a board member who was one of their largest donors make a racist statement at a public event, and went to the board, and basically they decided to let the person off the board, to no longer accept their donations, even though they're one of the biggest donors in the community, because they did not reflect or share the values. And what that showed the community was that they were serious, that they were willing to sacrifice resources on behalf of their values and not make excuses for it or let it happen. So these are the 5 practices that we focused on in our article. And Kirsten, I'm going to invite you to create 7 groups and set a timer for 15 minutes. And what I'm going to ask you to do, I'm putting the 5 practices in the chat box. And I'd like you to think about 2 things. Where's an area you think you could lean in on more or improve on? And what's a question you'd like to, that this is raising for you'd like to raise later? So those are the two questions. We're going to break you into groups for about 15 minutes. And then when you come back, we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A to hear some of your reflections and questions and engage on those. But want to create space to process some of this. And again, you'll get all these slides. And I'll ask Kirsten to kind of push the button to send people out, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. All right, great to see everyone again. Would love to open the floor to any reflections, questions, and especially hearing from your context. Again, a lot of the examples I share from our context here, and would love to hear any reflections you have or lessons or questions.
We'll get the ball rolling. There were two things.
Great, thanks, Jane.
So it was Jane, Gina, and Jackie. So I suppose the two things that we want to lean into, and Jackie might be a better example, is around how you maintain momentum to continue to seek information from service users, for want of a better word. That resourcing is part of it, but how do you use a lot of what we learn around policy and make it realistic for users in an ongoing way? Don't create another barrier. Jackie, you might want to give a bit more detail.
Jackie, you're muted, just so people know when you came in the main room, you all were muted. So if you want to speak, you got to make sure to unmute.
Yeah.
Thanks,
no,
Jackie.
No, Jen's explained kind of what the bones was. It's just about hearing the voices with recognition and respect, and having that incorporated into an ongoing relational service improvement, service delivery model. That it's not just the consultation and thank you, we'll take it from here. But it's the ongoing opportunity to feed into continuous improvement.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Jane and Jackie. And it just reminds me again of the point that one of the ways you build momentum is to be accountable for it. And when people say publicly, this is like how we're going to make decisions and how we're going to do our work, and enable themselves to be held accountable, it kind of puts a force behind maintaining that as a practice. I think the other thing that's there is making sure that those, you mentioned relationships, and I think that's so much of it too, and that's why we put that at the top of the list of accountable leadership, because it's not just about transactionally hearing from someone, it's about building relationships that can transform, that where you work with each other and get to know each other and make decisions with each other and deliberate together and work together. And again, it's relationships that build trust, and trust takes time and consistency to build, and that momentum comes from that. Yeah, Jackie?
Yeah, just to say that's my way of working, and over the years it's clearly become a problem because building that trust does take time. Time costs money, and it's hard to measure along the way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I don't have a solution other than it takes time, and time costs money, and we have to make that commitment and recognize it holds on. Yeah, thank you. Tui, I see you're raising your hand.
Yeah, I just sort of I'm involved in the Maori mental health, Maori being our Indigenous of Aotearoa, in case you don't know that, Paul. So I'm in the lived experience, mental health, Maori mental health lived experience space, and been in that space for about 26 years, and we're involved in a very collective movement in regards to not only challenging the westernized model way of practicing, but also challenging some of the legislation and on many other levels as well. So your mahi that you have shared with us actually you put it into words what we do quite naturally.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Which is really cool, actually, because I never know what we're doing. I just know what we're doing. You know what I mean? And so, you know, we're at that space where I guess we, you know, when I first started in the mental health experience space, there was 5 of us. You're lucky to count on one hand. And now we've got around 50 of us and 60 of us. And so some of the corridor now is about accountability, being accountable to each other. And even though we're employed by different organizations, if you hold a Māori space and you hold a Māori lived experience space, then as far as we're concerned, you are accountable back to us in the end. And so that's, and I hold that very dear. And also you know, we need to be committed. And I've lost jobs and so forth because I've been quite comfortable standing where I want to stand, and I don't want to be seen that I'm going to cross the floor and be a kupapa, you know, or somebody who's going to let our people down just because you put extra money or put something, you know, an incentive in front of my nose. That's not what I do this work for, and that's not what many of us are doing that work for. So I just wanted to mihi to you, Paul, in regards to the kōrero that you have introduced to me in Pākehā words, but I understand them in Māori actions. Kia ora.
Great. Thank you. And you remind me of, there's I think it's a Sufi Muslim parable that the frame of it is, you will only learn what you already know. And I find a lot of times, I remember when I first read the article Collective Impact, and I freaked out because I'm like, that's what we've been talking about, because we're trying to figure out, like, why are there so many good programs in our community, but when we add up all their outcomes, they're not changing anything. And then we're like, oh yeah, because they're all doing this isolated. If they all came together, and it wasn't like, to me, some rocket science they came up with, they just figured out what, like, a lot of people are thinking the same thing, and it was organic. And so wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Other questions and reflections? Yeah.
So I've got a bit of a question, Paul, because as you know, I'm a huge fan of this work. I really appreciate some of the diagrams that you shared this morning, because we had the same reflection in our group that it is so wonderful to see a way of explaining a te ao Māori worldview in a framework that other colleagues who perhaps don't have the same experience as I've had can relate to. So I totally tautoko everything that Tui was saying. But in terms of the centering equity, one of the comments you made was that we should always, you know, because I see my job in the lived experience advisory space as being to create safe spaces so that everybody can be heard. I am not here to speak for Māori. I am not here to speak for women. I'm not here to speak for the disabled community. I'm simply here to create the safe spaces where they can stand up and have their own stories and voices heard and be okay, right? Yeah. And so I sort of see my role as, if you like, creating safe spaces for that lived experience voice to be valued and heard equally, and in partnership with the other contributors at the table and valued as much. In that space, I kind of see myself as a bit of a champion for the voices of those with lived experience. And because of that, I tend to be quite singular in my focus in that. And I'm the one who's constantly nagging. It's like, where are the people with the lived experience? Where are the people, you know, and I ask anyone who knows me, I'm a bit of a broken record in that space. And I heard you mention earlier that we should always make space for people who are different to us. Whereas I feel that there aren't enough of us who look like me, smell like me, talk like me, right? So do you, and I mean, obviously I have an awareness that I don't suffer from every disability. I don't suffer from every mental health issue. I don't suffer from, so I'm simply trying to create that safe space for that lived experience voice. Do you see that as being an issue?
No, I mean, I think the thing that I was trying to get at is that I think there are people who have built tables and relationships and connections where they're able to check in on a variety of issues because they're in relationship with people who can bring perspectives and help them think through a bunch of different perspectives. And I think when we see a lot of groups that are primarily, filled with the dominant culture, they often don't have all those perspectives readily available to them. And so I think that it's important to create space. And you're right. I always say that no one can speak for a community. They can only be a voice from that community. Because I always joke here in my city, we had a Black sheriff who was a big supporter of Donald Trump and was a huge right-wing fanatic. He was a Black man from the poorest part of the city, but he was not, if he was the voice of the community, he started to reflect a lot of what people thought. And likewise, there might be somebody who has a very radical view on the other side, and they don't people in the community aren't I'm sure in your community, lots of people have different points of view on things and different perspectives. And so I always say that no one can be the voice of a community. If you set someone up to be the voice of a community, that's false. You can only have someone be a voice of community. And again, do you have enough different kinds of voices that you're able to bring in different perspectives and understand how things might look in different populations and with different groups? And I also often argue you can't create Noah's Ark. You can't have two of everything, right? You have to find ways to just have enough of a good sample of people of credibility. We always say that a good table of leadership has credibility across the stakeholder groups that are at the table. If everyone can kind of look and say, there's someone on there I trust, that's good. But if there's parts of the community feel like no one there knows them or has relationship with them or is trusted, that's where you run into problems.
Kia ora, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for Amarjit. Are we out of time?
We just, in terms of respecting everyone's time this morning, because I know we're going to bring you back, so we will follow on the conversation. But thank you. Really, you have actually, laid out centre and equity in a way that does resonate. So we'll be, having more conversations around this. One thing I just want to do before we go into closing karakia is just share a very quick slide to bring it back to our Aotearoa context. Obviously, everyone's aware of the health reforms, responding to the change. We've been talking about this for some time, and there are some quite major movements happening now in terms of the locality space. And we've obviously been advocating for collective impact as an approach to localities. And many of you would have seen our visual. We've taken this, and as Paul has advised us from the outset, collective impact isn't a formulaic approach. It's something that is adapted to your own unique circumstances, and that's what we've done here, and bringing in the additional paradigm around leadership, culture, iwi partnership. So there's much information we have on this, but I just wanted to bring it back to say that the collaborative is actually doing work in this space to support our communities on this collective impact journey in an approach that we hope has resonated, and obviously feedback that we've taken from our sector. Obviously, our unique position in terms of Aotearoa around Te Tiriti o Waitangi is embedded in all that we do, and we go back to the core principles highlighted in terms of the Ministry of Health documentation here in terms of the 5 principles, etc., which you're all very familiar with. But I do feel that the work across Aotearoa is pretty, and especially in health, very advanced in terms of equity, but a long way to go for sure. A long way to go, and more that we can do. But I'm going to pause there, and I'm going to ask Karoria Johns to do our close, our final word, and then do our closing karakia. And thank you everybody for being here this morning. And thank you, Paul. As I say, we'll be bringing you back for deeper dives.
Kia ora, Amarjit, and once again, just ngā mihi, Paul. So always such a wonderful kōrero having you here to to chat to us, and really looking forward to the next wānanga. Kia ora. Haere mai e te karakia whakamutunga e te whānau. Kia ora. Whakairia ake ke te kōrero, ki te pau tuarongo, hei tiki anō mō muri ake nei. Kia wātea ai, kia tina haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Hang the basket of knowledge upon the back post of the whare, so it may be collected again hereafter. Clear the space, know and understand. Join together, come together, be united as one. Ki he mauri ora, kia ora i te whānau.
Thank you, everybody.